So welcome everyone. Today we will continue the discussion that we started last week with Leonard Wantchekon on Tuesday, and the special session we had zooming on the role of Christian missions on education, human capital, fertility and household planning. We will continue our discussion about colonization. We will start zooming this week on the role of extractive colonial institutions that were pervasive all across the continent, although as it will become clearer today and tomorrow, those took various different forms. And alongside, we will also go over recent research in economics trying to assess the impact of colonial era investments on railroads, on roads, on transportation infrastructure more generally. At the time when European colonization in Africa was taking place, actually both pessimists and more optimists about imperial rule in Africa actually stressed that perhaps one of the beneficial aspects of colonization would regard the building of roads and railroads and other kind of infrastructure. So as always, we kindly ask you to submit your questions. Stelios, Nathan, Leonard, and the teaching team will try to address as many as they can live. And then our guest today, Tapiwa Ngara, will try to collect as many questions as possible, and we will devote at least half an hour from the 90 minutes today trying to address for many of your questions. Let me introduce our moderator for today, Tapiwa Ngara. So Tapiwa is, as I heard recently, he was born in Ethiopia. His parents come from Zimbabwe and Lesotho, and he grew up in Africa, where he studied in the University of Cape Town accounting and finance. He worked for a couple of years at Goldman Sachs. Then London Business School was very happy and pleased to recruit him. So Tapiwa completed his MBA at the London Business School, doing a gap year at MIT's Sloan School of Management. And currently he's an investment director based in South Africa on Value Capital Partners, in the intersection of private equity, public equity, and some VC. So Tapiwa, it's a great pleasure to see you. Thanks for being with us today. As I said, please feel free to start posing questions, and Tapiwa will try to collect them. So let me share my screen. Okay. So today we will try to zoom, and also tomorrow, on the impact of colonial era investments on roads and railroads mostly, the two aspects of infrastructure that have been studied the most by economic research, and try shedding some light on what we know about the legacy of extractive colonial rule that was pervasive, taking various forms in various parts of the continent. This kind of discussion fits into a broader kind of academic debate, mostly among Europeans rather than Africans, as we discussed last week, on what has been the more benign or the more malign views of colonization. So again, so here I decided to repeat a slide we saw last week. We have seen a couple of influential conjectures, not necessarily Africa focused, trying to shed light on how the colonial intervention, to use this wording, shaped contemporary development, not only in Africa, but also in the Americas, Asia, Oceania, across the world. Now, the challenge when one wants to shed light on such a very big question is at least twofold. First, it is very hard to come up with a counterfactual of no colonization, simply because most contemporary countries, to a lesser or greater extent, they were affected by imperial rule of some sort. Secondly, even those countries that were not strictly speaking being colonized, we have at least two in Africa, Liberia and Ethiopia, but of course some European countries, actually they were also affected by the modus and the mode of economic activity at the time. And to form this macro counterfactual, one has to think how African political and economic institutions would have evolved in the absence of colonization, something very challenging. And on top of that, as we have discussed in detail in week 3, and to some extent also in week 4, Europeans' modern intervention with the continent starts with the preceding to colonization slave trades that, as Nathan Nunn discussed, had lasting deleterious consequences for the continent. Now, the second key challenge is that colonization is, in a sense, a composite, or if you prefer, a bundle treatment. While Europeans were extracting, they were killing many Africans, among others, and they were stealing and looting its riches. At the same time, we had some infrastructure investments, as we will discuss today. And as we discussed last week with Catherine and Etienne and Dozier, there were also some investments by Christian missions, for example, or the administration on schools, clinics, and various other issues. So modern economic research effectively tries to zoom into the issues that you see here, try to so-called unbundle the treatment, and identify sources of quasi-random variation in those interventions to advance on causation, identify the causal effect of, let's say, of building a road or building a colonial railroad or being very extractive, let's say, in one part of Congo Free State as compared to another part, and trying to advance in telling something about the causal effect. Of course, coming and approximating causal effects for such macro scale questions is also quite challenging. For example, European colonizers and also post-independence African leaders didn't build railroads at random. Railroads typically in most parts of the world connect big cities, or they may connect to some port, a mineral-rich, for example, area. At the same time, it is quite likely that those areas that receive, quote unquote, a transportation infrastructure treatment, at the same time, the administration may build some schools, or it may be easier for missionaries to go there and build some, missionary school or missionary clinic. And as we discussed again in the earlier lectures, we have seen, for example, that many of the railroad and Christian mission investments did happen in areas that were affected adversely by the preceding slave trades. So it's very hard to come up with very clean identification or with very good experiments where we isolate the effect, let's say, of a colonial road or a colonial railroad or some colonial era extractive institutional practice. On top of that, we have some other conceptual issues. First of all, as we discussed, for example, with Tanner Regan in the special session on data, or with Wood, Marlus, and Morten in the first week, historical data are noisy, and measurement error does not necessarily takes the classical form. For example, it may be easier to get data, let's say, on schools where you had some European teachers as compared to some colonial era schools without, let's say, European teachers. And a second issue is that of spatial spillovers, an issue that we will try to shed some light today. For example, if you build a railroad, this may have some local effects, but some areas, let's say, adjacent or a bit further away from the colonial railroads or the colonial routes may benefit, or actually they may lose, because people may move from, let's say, a village 20 kilometers from a town with a city, with a town with a railroad, and therefore we need to start thinking about spillover effects across space. And of course, as we have already alluded to, there is the issue of heterogeneity, an issue that Roland Pongou will shed some light, zooming into colonial Nigeria to Bono. Now, all of the interventions that we will look in this lecture series, also what we discussed with Leonard on education and Catherine and Dozier and Etienne last week, quite likely have heterogeneous effects. And therefore, those colonial era policies, extractive institutions, or pro-growth kind of developments that railroads may have shaped long-run development in the continent by affecting the distribution of power, or if you prefer, economic or political inequality very early on. Now, The last remark that I want to make before I zoom into some exciting pieces of research that tries to shed light on what has been the legacy of colonial era transportation investments or colonial era extractive institutions is that we can learn a lot about colonization and those particular aspects of colonization, looking not only in Africa, but also outside Africa. Colonization affected all parts of the world, and there is very exciting work looking at the short, medium, and long-run effects of colonization, let's say in Peru, in Bolivia, in many parts of the world, in Indonesia, and many other parts. So these are some of the works that I will try to shed some light today. The slides that will be uploaded soon at the course website will be intentionally long because many of you are posing questions about and asking about follow-up readings. So they are intentionally long. I will not discuss all of them, but hopefully in the discussion, we can zoom into some issues. So let me start with quote unquote, perhaps the positives of investments that took place during colonization, zooming into investments that took the form of railroads mostly and a bit of road kind of investments. Now, let me say that at the time of European colonization, you had very opposing figures like Cecil Rhodes or Vladimir Lenin that thought, Lenin of course being extremely skeptical about colonization in Africa as in other continents, suggesting that at least the buildup of railroads would be something beneficial for the continent in the years to come, because at the time, a quite dominant conjecture among politicians and development scholars was the idea of the big push, that at some point countries, regions, societies need some form of a big investment, and railroads and roads seems like this kind of investment, subject to very large fixed cost that is necessary to jumpstart economic activity. And actually, we have seen a lot of research in economics, not only looking in Africa, but looking elsewhere, among others also in the United States and the United Kingdom, trying to shed light on how industrialization does take place. Nonetheless, this optimistic view about colonization, and again, one aspect of colonization, eventually didn't get you very far, and the examples of Ghana and Mozambique illustrate that. So let me just pick Mozambique, a country which is very large, size-wise. For the Europeans, think about it as something like 1.5 times the size of Italy. Since I'm Greek, I tend to think that Mozambique is 7 times the size of Greece. Effectively, during colonization, we had 3 to 4 railroads, so very limited kind of investment. And also those railroads, rather than connecting the main economic hubs of Mozambique, Nampula, Nampula in the north, Beira in the center, and Maputo in the south, effectively, rather than connecting the big cities and initiating industrialization within the colony at the time, actually connected agricultural rich and mineral rich areas, actually in Rhodesia at the time or in Malawi, with the 3 main ports, because the objective of Europeans, at least in both actually of those 2 countries, was to transfer the resources from the inland into the ports and effectively in Europe and the industrializing Americas. In Ghana, effectively the strategy was the same. The mineral rich area with the Asante region with very long and a very well documented gold mines and deposit, as well as the agricultural rich area. The objective of the British administration was effectively to connect those areas with the ports and ship the goods out. There was a very brief period of Italian rule or influence in Ethiopia. Again, Ethiopia, a very large country, the 2nd largest in terms of population African country. And this map that comes from good work of Mattia Bertazzini at Oxford shows the very limited buildup of colonial railroads in Ethiopia. Again, this is a map covering 39 sub-Saharan African countries, so not North Africa and not South Africa. Effectively, you see very limited kind of investments. So in a nutshell, without even going into the details of the various case studies, you can immediately see that even if one was to take a very optimistic viewpoint about the benefits of the buildup of colonial railroads and colonial roads, still those were not many. So even if the econometric analysis reveals considerable effect, actually those effects will not be large on aggregate simply because Africa is very big and we had very limited railroad and road investments. Now, this is just some works, and we see very exciting and growing research in this area, trying to assess the impact of colonial era railroads or roads, transportation infrastructure and investments on various aspects of economic activity. Now, again, we can learn a lot about the persistent effect of transportation investments looking outside Africa. For example, there is a very fascinating work by Dave Donaldson and Rick Hornbeck looking in the US, a country where actually most people, non-economists actually, mostly will tell you that, look, the railroads that were built in the US was a key driving force of the second industrial revolution there. And actually, in line with this interpretation, Donaldson and Hornbeck document very large effects coming from this kind of investments. Now, I want to focus and discuss briefly some applications. Again, in the syllabus, you will find many, and in the weekly Q&A, we will provide you with additional references. Zooming mostly in the case of Ghana, but also I will briefly discuss some results from Kenya, Ethiopia, and some pan-Sun African kind of estimates from very cool work of Remit Zetwab, among others. So these are the colonial railroads in Gold Coast or contemporary Ghana. Ghana during the colonial times was split into the northern territories, the Asante region and Gold Coast. As you can see, for a very big kind of country, very limited kind of transportation infrastructure investments. And effectively, what you see here very cleanly, especially if you zoom in 1931, so on your left, you see that the main cities, so the main hubs of economic activity were established, especially in the south and the Asante region, close to those colonial era railroads. And even if one was to go to the more contemporary period, so 40 years after, 43 years after the independence of Ghana, still you see a lot of economic activity. So the main hubs, the main towns and cities being in the vicinity of colonial roads and colonial railroads, as in this application. So the research effectively conducts a couple of econometric or correlational kind of analysis, and what effectively those specifications, those positive and with star specifications illustrate is that in those places in Ghana that they were closer to the colonial railroads, recall those railroads were very, very limited. We see a boost in agricultural production, in cocoa production. We see a dense population activity and higher levels of urbanization. And actually, this is quite important because there is a long tradition and considerable amount of research in economics revealing that we do have large productivity gains, mostly concentrated in big cities and large towns. So urbanization tends to go handy with riches, with economic development more generally. Nonetheless, as we have discussed actually by now quite a few times, it is actually quite challenging to interpret those correlations as causal for a very simple reason. The places where Europeans built the railroads were not random. As already discussed, those actually railroads connected important cities in the production of agricultural goods and also gold. So, in other words, the allocation of railroads was clearly non-random. So, a challenging issue is what can we do as researchers in order to advance on causation? And the idea that the scholars here, Remit Zetwab and Alex Moradi, had was effectively to delve into history, so read the colonial archives, read the historical accords about British rule in Gold Coast, and effectively realized that the administration actually had planned to build more rail lines, more railroads than effectively they did. So what you see here is that you see the actual railroads that connect, for example, Accra to Tafo and Sekondi to Kumasi, but effectively you see also some other planned railroads that effectively were not built. So under the assumption that those railroads that were planned, they were designed, and there was a lot also of preliminary work towards building them, but in the end they were not built for some random kind of reason, then one could compare areas, let's say in the vicinity or nearby the roads that were effectively built to the vicinity or the neighborhood of those planned railroads that were not built, and effectively account for selection or account for the fact that in this case, the European colonizers were not randomly building railroads. And effectively, if you do this kind of analysis, which is what you see here in columns 6 and 7, you tend to find kind of very similar effects in the sense that those areas that happen to be close into those areas where the railroads were built did benefit considerably in terms of higher agricultural productivity, more dense population in the 30s and the 40s that persists till today. Similar kind of analysis looking here in Kenya. So this is the railroad system at Kenyan independence. And again, you see a lot of urbanization and population density in the places surrounding those colonial railroads, and effectively the distribution of economic activity going now to 2009, 2010 is again centered around those areas. Similar kind of evidence when Mattia looks in the case of Ethiopia, higher wealth when you go in the vicinity of 10 kilometers close from the railroads that were built in the 30s in Ethiopia. And actually, perhaps more importantly, you see less agricultural productivity. So you see industrialization, the movement out of agriculture into manufacturing or services. And you also see more skilled manual work and more professional, in line with this very old conjecture in development economics, saying that, look, you need significant and with high fixed cost kind of investments in order to jumpstart the metastasis of economic activity from agriculture into manufacturing and services, what development scholars have coined from the traditional into the modern kind of sector. Similar kind of evidence when one takes a pan-Sub-Saharan African viewpoint. Again, South Africa is not included in this sample. And here, what I decided to show you is going now into the post-independence period. So you see the roads at the end of colonial rule. Again, the early 60s is when most African countries obtain independence from colonization ends. You see very limited kind of investments, especially in Central Africa, in Angola, in Namibia. But as you see, roads actually build on the expanding road network, so still we see inertia, not only in Africa, but also elsewhere in where roads were built. Perhaps most importantly, in some recent work, Remy Jedwab and Adam Storigard actually tried to shed light not only on the local effects of building in roads, but perhaps also on spillovers. And what I want to stress here is that the overall effects tends to be considerable, in line with evidence coming from the US, coming from various other settings, suggesting that when you build a railroad or a road, not only the areas that are nearby benefit, but you have also considerable relocation of economic activity, and therefore also nearby areas that are indirectly connected to the transportation network also benefit considerably. So to sum up, a significant body of economic research has tried to find interesting ways looking at placebos, or looking what's happening on small villages that happen to be in between two main cities that the administration wants to connect with a main road or a main railroad to advance on causation. The evidence we have is that railroads and roads have sizable local effects, And those local effects tend to work with a mechanism that is already well understood in economics. You have a clustering of economic activity nearby the roads and the railroads, and you have some form of agglomeration kind of effect. Economic activity tends to happen mostly in cities, especially in manufacturing and services, and therefore we have the buildup of roads leading to local development, and of course having some spillover kind of effects. Tomorrow, Roland Pongu will discuss the case of Nigeria, which is a very fascinating case and very important also based on its size, showing also some heterogeneous effects of transportation infrastructure, because a key feature of this type of investment is that it often comes with additional kind of investments. Now, from a more development viewpoint, though, we should never forget that although most, if not all of those studies document sizable effects, let me stress for once more that at independence, there were very few roads in Africa, and there were even fewer, if I was to go back on my slides, there were even fewer colonial railroads. So those kind of investments, even if one was to take the most optimistic view, did not have very large effects for the continent. As Belinda Archibong will discuss tomorrow, again zooming in Nigeria, many of those railroads and roads were built with prison labor, with forced labor, with the Europeans being a very, very extractive. So it is far from clear that if one was to take a more generic kind of viewpoint, an angle that this translated into something positive. But again, I want to stress that those investments were not very large to start with. Now, let me try to go to the second topic of our discussion today, colonial era institutions in Africa. As we started discussing last week, those kind of institutions, with perhaps a couple of exceptions, and I will mention one, were very extractive. The imperial powers came up with a plethora of extractive kind of institutions, some under so-called direct rules, where the Europeans themselves, either the administration or private companies that the administration often outsourced the ruling of the interior, were very extractive. We had very brutal practices, forced labor, prison labor, genocide in many instances, but also in places where Europeans applied so-called native or indirect rulers, for example, in the north of Nigeria, or in the interior of Sierra Leone, or in the north part of German East Africa, contemporary Namibia. In those places, we still had a lot of extraction and a lot of authoritarian and despotic kind of. Labor arrangements in particular were extremely extractive. We had forced labor, and actually, as we will discuss tomorrow with Belinda, various forced labor schemes that were very close to slavery effectively, although in most parts of Africa, slavery was abolished at the time, at least officially. And we also had two effectively very generic and abstract modes of economic activity. The one where you had large plantations, actually this was part of Mozambique that I discussed before, in the case of Mozambique, mostly on cotton, with very big owners, often, or in almost all cases, non-Africans, where the local population were forced to work there. And actually, there were even restrictions in the movement of people in order to prevent Africans fleeing. And then we also had in some other cases what has been coined by actually African scholars and Marxist scholars as peasant economies, where you had large companies with monopoly power effectively purchasing the goods at pre-specified prices as they were dictated by the colonial administration that was working hand in hand with those European companies. So there has been, and what you see here are some, I would say, important works that try to shed light on the short and mostly on the long run effects of various extractive institutional arrangements across the continent. I will mostly, Sarah Lowe's will visit us in 2 weeks and she will discuss her paper, so I have left it in the end. So Lowe's and Mentoro look at the case, the infamous case and the notorious rule of King Leopold II of Belgium in the so-called Congo Free State. Belinda Archibog and Nonso will discuss tomorrow their fascinating work on prison labor in Nigeria. Arthur Bluen has an interesting paper looking at colonial era extractive institutions in Rwanda. Leonard has a very interesting paper with Gancia Ponce looking in Madagascar. So there's like a lot of work assessing the legacy of various extractive institutional arrangements. Of course, Europeans not only were extractive, but they tried to tax a lot the local population. And actually, we will have next week Jutta Bolt and Lee Gardner discussing their very important work measuring colonial era taxation that took again various forms and assessing its legacy. Thirdly, we see a lot of work, and I will discuss at least this very interesting paper of Acemoglu, Reed, and Robinson, trying to measure and quantify how Europeans ruled Africa, especially its interior, mostly through indirect rule, and what were the legacies of this indirect rule for the development. For example, a very influential thesis put forward by Mahmoud Mamdani argues that one of the most negative aspects of European colonization was the empowerment of non-accountable local chiefs and local rulers whose power persisted after decolonization and during independence. The fact that African states inherited very weak state capacity from the Europeans when they left meant that actually those local elites maintained their privileges and political power throughout most of the post-independence period. So recall that the very influential conjecture of Acemoglu, Johnson, and Robinson suggests that in those places where Europeans faced very adverse living conditions, malaria, yellow fever, very isolated from Europe, in those places they set up a very extractive colonial model or strategy, if you prefer, with very limited kind of investments, because their objective was to extract the riches of those colonies and effectively ship them back to Europe or to the Americas. Important aspects of the Acemoglu, Johnson, and Robinson conjecture relates to the persistence of institutions, and perhaps most importantly, the persistence of political or economic power, issues that relate to economic and political inequality in development. Now, I want to discuss 3 case studies, time permitting. I will go relatively quickly and I will leave time in case we want to delve on those issues in the discussion. So I want to start with actually the success story. So what can we learn from the interesting case of Botswana? Contrast this with Sierra Leone, and time permitting, I will try to shed some light on what we know from academic research on the legacy of one of the most infamous cases of colonial extraction, the Congo Free State of Belgian King Leopold II. Now, effectively, this graph illustrates that Botswana stands out as a significant African success story. When British colonization ends in the early 60s, Botswana, under most scholars and most evidence, is one of the poorest African and newly independent states at the time. Very few people had attended college or high school. There were very limited railroad or road investments, as we discussed earlier, and the mode of economic activity was, quote unquote, a lot oriented towards pastoral activities and with very little services or manufacturing. Nonetheless, you fast forward half a century, or you go to today, and actually we have seen a remarkable transformation in Botswana, and it's one of those cases with very fast growth, at least in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, with some growth slowdown happening actually in the past decade. For example, is a GDP per capita in purchasing power parity terms, so adjusting for difference in the cost of living, hovers around 17,000 US dollars just before the pandemic. And just to give this in perspective, Sierra Leone, the country that I will discuss later, the income of the average person in Sierra Leone is 10 times lower than the average income in real terms as compared to his or her counterpart in Botswana. This should not be seen as saying that Botswana, everything is perfect there. There are various issues, especially on the health side, but Botswana stands out, for example, as being a diamond-rich country with very efficient use of natural resources, democratic, with some issues. No democracy is perfect since independence, and no major conflict since independence. Now, there has been actually a lot of interest in trying to assess and shed some light on why this is the case. And on top of that, perhaps I should stress that Botswana is a landlocked country. Overall, landlocked countries tend to have challenges shipping their goods outside. And in the neighborhood of Botswana, you see countries like Mozambique, like Zimbabwe, like Congo, like Angola, countries that are very politically unstable. And still, Botswana has achieved, remarkable transformation post-independence. So there are two vintages that effectively kind of converge, and they're both institutional at heart, of the success of Botswana. To start with, in what was Botswana, the Bechuanaland at the time, it roughly speaking overlaps with the historical Tswana kingdoms, and Tswana kingdoms were actually politically centralized, and recall the evidence that Stelios Michalopoulos went over in week 3, showing that in those regions where you had politically strong African groups, we see higher levels of development today. The Tswana institutions had some interesting features. There were checks and balances on chiefs. There was the kotla, actually there were many kotlas, there were very assemblies where elders were debating politics. There was private ownership of cattle, although public ownership to chiefs of land. And there was some kind of a strong sense of statehood, or some moderate sense of statehood in the part that effectively came to be known as Botswana when European colonization happened. Now, interestingly, European colonization in Botswana is very mild in the following sense. At the time, the diamonds had not been discovered. Europeans, and especially the British, were not particularly interested in this part of the world. They wanted this area mostly for a balance of power kind of argument. And also because their interest was in South Africa, and Botswana was used at the time as a so-called labor reserve. EA workers were leaving Botswana to work in the silver mines and the other mines in Johannesburg and the other places in South Africa. Now, at some point, Cecil Rhodes tried to convince the Brits that his company should take over the administration of Botswana, as it did in southern Rhodesia at the time. And what is very interesting, and there are various photos of that, 3 Tswana chiefs visited London in 1895, so they did the long journey in an effort to meet Queen Victoria and persuade her that they should maintain the ruling of their people, and they tried to convince the British that the protectorate should not be controlled by Cecil Rhodes' company. For the various reasons that are mostly idiosyncratic, this did happen. So Botswana during the colonial times was ruled effectively by the Tswana kings, and the pre-existing chieftaincy and political structure, its economic and political elites, maintained their power and of course their legitimacy. So the taxes that they were raised, they were used locally, and effectively, and this should be one very interesting takeaway, is that if one was to look at the most successful, or one of the most successful African cases, colonization was very mild at the minimum. It just happens that in those places you also had some strong pre-colonial ethnic structures that developed actually during colonization and further developed post-independence. But actually this immediately tells you that in all other places where European colonization was quite dense and quite extractive, this is to put the blame, at least partly, for the underdevelopment of those former colonies and protectorates post-independence. And let me now jump to Sierra Leone. Now, Sierra Leone is a country with one of the lowest outputs per capita in Africa. Again, something like a tenth of what it is in Botswana just before the pandemic. Depending on the data sources, there is either no growth post-independence or even negative growth. So just imagine that you obtain independence, and at the time, Sierra Leone is one of the poorest parts of the world. And you fast forward 5 decades and still you see very little improvements. And even, we discussed a lot about the problems on properly measuring output and income. You don't have to go much further than looking at the sad story of Sierra Leone with recurrent conflicts, very politically unstable, very inefficient use of its natural riches, diamonds, again in this case. And what is further interesting, and I want to pose it as a question and as an indication to reflect, is that if anything, Sierra Leone's position, at least ex ante, seems to be way better than the one of Botswana. First of all, it has access to the sea. It's relatively close to both Europe and the Americas on the other side of the Atlantic. But let me refresh your memory. As we discussed with Nathan back in week 2 and 3, actually, the fact that Sierra Leone was closer to the Americas and Europe meant that Sierra Leone was mostly affected by the slave trades, while Botswana was not much affected, if at all. Now, in very interesting work, Daron Acemoglu, Tristan Reed, and Jim Robinson, they did something which I think illustrates the usefulness of marrying economics with history and political science, which in some sense, it's the starting point of this lecture series that Nathan, Leonard, Stelios, and I put together. What the 3 scholars did was the following. Again, reading into the fascinating history of Sierra Leone, they came to realize that the British in the late 19th century, in 1895-96, they appointed so-called paramount chiefs, their own chiefs, to rule the interior of Sierra Leone. Now here there is an interesting difference with Botswana. In Botswana, there used to be a strong and politically centralized chiefdoms, while the Mende and the Temne, at least at the time, they were not very much politically organized, and you had chiefs at the local level, but not at some higher kind of level. So the administration, the British administration at the time, decides to rule the interior through indirect rule, which was a very widespread practice, especially of the British, and they appointed some ruling families. And you can see here the chiefdoms as of 1898 in Sierra Leone. Now, Tristan, Jim, and Daron, what they did is they went into the data. As we have discussed a lot, the colonial administration was recording actually quite in a decent manner, at least, the administration. So what you see here is that you have some parts where you have many ruling families, so many local chiefs, while you have some other places where you do not have many local chiefs. Here you have, let's say, a monopolist in the local political power. Now, those chiefs during the colonial times were the agents of the administration. They were collecting taxes. They were assisting private companies that were exploiting the interior of Sierra Leone. And effectively, they were the conduit, if you like, of imperial rule. Now, what is interesting is that Daron, Tristan, and Jim managed to trace the subsequent generation of those early political elites. Actually, in Sierra Leone, chiefs are officially recognized. And what they found is that in those places where in the colonial times you had many chiefs, actually today you have more intense political competition. This Herfindahl index is a measure of fragmentation or of political competition, if you prefer. So this is actually very interesting because it lies at the heart of this very bold conjecture connecting what happened during colonization and what happens today, because it shows you that the distribution of political and economic power during colonization does persist over time. During this time, we had, of course, independence of Sierra Leone, we had democratic rule, we have autocratic rule, we have at least 2 major civil wars, and still we see significant inertia in the distribution of political power at the local level. Actually, one could say that the fact that the state apparatus collapsed with the civil war, effectively this in relative terms strengthened the role of those local elites that were appointed, or their parents or their grandparents were appointed by the British to rule the interior. Now, what is very interesting is that if one goes now today, one does see that in those places where you have many ruling families, so think about it as political competition at the local level, you see more employment outside agriculture, so a good thing, so transformation. You see households with better access to public goods, so this would be the DHS wealth kind of index. The houses are quote unquote of better quality, and those actually correlations, retain their economic and statistical significance even when one controls for, local geographic or other characteristics. So the takeaway from this very, very interesting academic piece of research based on very meticulous data work, because the 3 authors had to record the name of each ruling family back in 1998 and trace each family of chiefs over time, suggests that in line with this idea of Mahmoud Mamdani, we have persistence of local political power with chiefs maintaining their power and privileges over time. It is also very important, this piece of research from an academic viewpoint in economics, because it's one of the few case studies. There are a couple of others looking in Latin America and the Caribbean islands, suggesting that you see considerable persistence and inertia in political and economic power. Now, let me conclude with a third application illustrating the legacy of colonial era institutions. So let me now zoom into the Democratic Republic of Congo. Now, if you read the international press, at least this is the viewpoint in Europe and the Americas, there is a lot of blame put on the 2 Kabilas, Joseph and Laurent Kabila, that ruled Congo till very recently, actually, when Joseph Kabila stepped down, have been ruling Congo, the 2 Kabilas, since 1997. Now, interestingly, if one was to put the blame on those 2 individuals, at least the way economists think about it is that it's perhaps incomplete for the following reason. If one was to look at their predecessors, Mobutu Sese Seko, he was also very despotic, extractive. There are various anecdotes and stories on how Mobutu looted effectively the riches of his country, of his extravagances, flying with private jets from Congo to go shopping in Europe. Interestingly, though, the colonial origin thesis of comparative development argues that to understand the extraction that took place in Congo, or Zaire, as Mobutu at one point renamed Congo, one has to understand what happened during the colonial times. And actually during the colonial times, what is today the Democratic Republic of Congo was Belgian Congo, or Congo Free State. Now, interestingly, Congo Free State was something like a private property in the beginning, at least, of King Leopold II, King of Belgium, who in the infamous Berlin conference that Stelios briefly discussed with Jeff Herbst in lecture 5, managed to secure a vast piece of land at the time, effectively being the person in between the French and the British, who at the time were fighting a lot during the scramble for Africa. King Leopold was related to the British royal family. He secured many loans from French banks, and therefore both the British and the French thought that they had some influence on him. Now, King Leopold, however, rule is notorious in the case of Congo, and there is a lot of evidence documenting the atrocities that happened in the interior of Congo. For example, this book of Adam Hochschild is fantastic and illustrates very well what happened during the time. And of course, for most of us, at least in Europe and the US, we have all read, or most of us have read, Joseph Conrad's important book, Heart of Darkness, that illustrates the atrocities that happened during his rule at the interior of Congo, actually focusing on ivory trade at the time. Now, what is interesting is that King Leopold, the way he ruled Congo was very ruthless. Genocide happened, many Africans died under devastating situations. But actually, King Leopold, the way he ruled Congo was, let me call it, as a very modern kind of way, in the sense that realizing that he couldn't rule this very big piece of colony, piece of land, if you prefer, he outsourced to private companies, concessionary companies, that got allocated big swaths of land. And effectively, they were raising capital, those companies were raising capital from European capital markets or from famous investors at the time. And they were doing the exploitation with, Leopold having various schemes, either holding some equity in those companies or getting some tax revenues out. So in a very interesting paper that I just want to briefly mention, and we will have Sarah Lowe's discussing in 2 weeks, Leopold granted big pieces of land into private companies, and two of the most notorious, at least in the early phase of Congo Free State, were two companies that at the time were exploiting wild rubber. Recall, the scramble for Africa takes place at a time where commodity prices are perhaps at all-time high, and rubber is a key ingredient necessary for the Industrial Revolution. And at the time, we see a lot of interest of Europeans in Africa for wild rubber, and actually subsequently also for quote-unquote cultivated kind of rubber. So Sarah Luz and Eduardo Montero, who at the time were doctoral students at Harvard University, effectively, they tried to measure what has been the impact in the development of Congo, looking at what happened just outside to what happened just inside those concessionary boundaries, because most of the conflict, the violence, the extraction, and the genocide happened within rather than outside. So this kind of analysis we have already seen, and I know that with a great teaching fellow team, you already discussed a lot. So effectively, what I want to show here is just two so-called discontinuity kind of graphs. So this graph plots education inside the concession boundaries and just outside. Recall, a lot of the extraction was happening within rather than outside. And you do see somewhat higher levels of education outside as compared to inside, although now the analysis here is carried away 100 years after the end of those concessionary agreements. One could look at some measure of wealth and access to basic public goods. Again, kind of similar pattern, somewhat higher levels of development outside the boundaries as compared to within. Now, I don't want to go much into the details and leave perhaps some of it for the discussion, so let me try to pause here and just illustrate that this case in Congo is actually very interesting for the following reason. First, Belgian rule and Leopold's rule in Congo was extractive all across. It just happens that within the boundaries of those two concession agreements, and there were a couple of others, actually we see even more. So here the comparison is someone effectively is comparing villages and parts of Congo with very brutal and extractive colonial extraction to some other places where they had an even more brutal and extractive during colonization institutional arrangement. So we are comparing, two instances of very extractive in nature institutions. And still we find that being extremely extractive is associated with lower economic development today, many years and decades after the end of time. Interestingly, and let me stop here, when Sarah and Eduardo investigate the mechanisms, what is very interesting is that in the boundaries, within the boundaries of those colonial concessions, chiefs are more powerful. Recall, the Europeans ruled also the interior of Congo through those chiefs. So those chiefs were empowered during the Leopold's rule, and it seems to have maintained at least part of the despotic rule today. And actually, this despotic rule goes handy with under provision of public goods of education and health. So the analysis here squares well with the analysis on Sierra Leone, showing that empowering those local chiefs, giving them more power and of course the guns and the means to be very extractive during the colonial times, coupled with a very weak state capacity of African states at independence, which if anything became worse because of recurrent conflict, we see institutional inertia and inertia in development to a great extent reflecting the very persistent concentration of political and economic power at the local level. So let me pause here, and perhaps we will discuss some of those issues during the Q&A. Tapiwa, I think you must have collected various questions.
Thank you very, very much, Elias, for a very riveting presentation. And certainly I can say that as a proud alumnus of the LBS class of 2014 full-time MBA program, it's been very clear to me that Africa has been a region of special strategic interest to the school. And this outstanding series of lectures by the Wheeler Institute with thousands of registered attendees is just another example of the school's leadership in this area. Lots of debate and discussion within the chat around a number of areas, and particularly around the point, Elias, that you started on, which is the difficulty in thinking about the counterfactual of a Africa picture without colonization. However, I think some of the questions will tease out some elements of this that are of interest to the audience. So maybe jumping right in, one question that arose from the comment that you made about policies and interventions and infrastructure going hand in hand was, is there any evidence of a difference in infrastructure development between colonies where the colonizers had a more assimilative view of the colony versus a more extractive view? And there was a number of questions related to this around potentially a development of national identity with linked to the colonial power, mixed race offspring. Is there any difference between colonial countries where we see more willingness to invest in human capital based on a difference on assimilative versus extractive motives?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So let me again try to clarify some issues. First, we do observe differences across colonies, across contemporary countries, but actually, and this we will show this more and more as the course develops, we see also big differences within contemporary countries across regions. So let me pick one example related to your question: railroad investments. So railroad investments, as I showed, have positive local effects. Now, the downside is that there were not that many railroads. So any of those local effects were, in the case of Mozambique, there are around 3.5, 4 railroad lines. In the case of Ghana, of 2. Now, the fact that Europeans had, they wanted to build those railroads in Mozambique to connect it with Harare, actually, the one line with Malawi in the other case, because those were agricultural rich areas, actually benefited those areas as well. And to the extent that there is inertia on this, clearly this was, quote unquote, a positive that emerged. Nonetheless, let me start now going into the negatives. That first of all, a lot of colonial infrastructure, railroads and roads, were built by Africans through very brutal practices, something that Nonson and Belinda will discuss tomorrow in the case of Nigeria. So it was, at the same time, you were doing something good, but imprisoning people and forcing them to work under devastating situation. For example, in the case of Namibia, thousands died during those colonial infrastructure investments. Now, overall, Europeans, the way they approached the colonies, here I will be very abstract, is that in the early phase, when they have sent those explorations, or where you had some private companies initiating the exploration, or some Christian missions initiating the explorations, Uganda is one, Malawi could be another one. At the time, they perhaps had in mind a more development kind of agenda. Very soon, however, and especially as the scramble for Africa was getting steam, the strategy that was coming from the metropole to the administrators on the ground was that, to use the modern jargon, run a fiscal, do not run fiscal deficits. In the sense that if you were the ruler, let's say, of the Gambia or a part of Nigeria, you could do some investments, and actually the metropole did want the investments, but at the same time, do not expect a check to come from London or from Paris, let's say, to Accra. So therefore, the administrators were faced with this trade-off that on the one hand, perhaps they wanted to do some investments and promote development for European interest and perhaps with some benefits according to the local population, but they were very massively constrained, especially because Africa at the time needed those very big infrastructural investments that required a very big investment to start with. So what was the consequence? Many of the railroads were actually built by private companies, which of course, actually Mozambique and Cecil Rhodes being one very good example, the Northern Line was built by his company. So effectively what he was maximizing was, how to get the riches of the agricultural rich area and ship them out. So it was not done by some central government or some coordination device that factors in that if we connect, let's say, in Mozambique, Maputo and Beira, we can have significant development. And this, and let me connect this to our discussion last week, this was also done to a great extent for education and health. Christian missions were quote unquote welcomed because they were building schools, and this fitted the agenda of the administration because in principle they had promised to the motherland that they will build schools, but of course they didn't have the resources to build the schools.
Thanks for that very, very illuminating response. I think it links quite tightly to the second question that I want to bring to light here. So it's quite startling when you looked at the map of the railroad infrastructure development that it seemed to be particularly concentrated in the earliest phase of the colonial mission, so from 1890 to 1910, and then seems to taper out somewhat after that. So I guess the question that has come up is, what sort of time frame or long-term investment horizon did the colonial powers have in initially setting down the infrastructure for the colonial mission, or was this really derailed by the scramble for Africa, and hence we don't see the densification of some of those preliminary planned networks? And linked to that, was there any serious intention to transfer skills to local, to be able to maintain and progress development of the infrastructure for the colonial project?
Very good questions, both. So, first of all, the European colonization overall strategy does change over time. Nonetheless, I think it is fair to say that it never had a very long run, investment horizon, to use your jargon. Recall that when Africa is being colonized, Latin America is already decolonized. So I think it's not crazy that Europeans, although at the time nobody could foresee African independence, especially because at the time there was pervasive racism, they never took very long-run kind of investments. Second, a lot of the early investments did happen by private companies, and we will have a special session on that in 2 weeks with Giorgio Chiavelli. And actually, those companies had raised capital from markets or from high net worth individuals, to use again the contemporary jargon, and they were impatient. Another critical issue is that they had like a short-run horizon, and we have some adverse shocks, World War I, the Great Depression, and during this time we see a collapse of economic activity across Africa. So to come back to your question, the strategy of Europeans does change, but they never have a very long-run kind of investment agenda. Plus, effectively after World War II, it is, I think, becoming abundantly clear to Europeans that sooner or later, those former colonies, will be independent states. North Africa has already decolonized. India decolonizes immediately after World War II. So it's already a time when they will not do much investment. And actually, a very interesting case is Portugal, that resists independence under the Salazar dictatorship. And actually, at the time, they decide very late to start doing investments, at least in Mozambique. So the Cabora Bassa Dam, one of the largest at the time in the world and in Africa, was built very late in the colonial time because Portugal wanted to signal to the world that they mean development for the colonies. But at the time, the decolonization war had started, the war for independence had started, and therefore actually the Cabora Bassa Dam actually never functioned in full capacity. It was mined and mined again, half destroyed. So we have this interesting dynamics. You're muted, Tapiwa.
It's fascinating, really fascinating. Thanks for that. Maybe just a quick double click on this theme. The question that has come is, was there any link between disease or climatic conditions and the colonial infrastructure that was laid down?
That's another good question. So a couple of points. First, the railroads and roads were almost exclusively built by Africans. So Africans were the ones who suffered the most by, working day and night, midday with very hot conditions. Second, most of the railroads were quote unquote in the coastline or close to the coastline. So the idea was to connect the mineral rich or the agricultural soil rich areas and connect them to the ports. The third one, which I want to stress, is that the objective of the colonial administration, not necessarily the colonial administration, but the private companies that built those, was to extract the resources. There was no such thing as coordination, which if you think about it, again, South Africa perhaps is an exception here to the rule. If you think about how railroads were built, let's say in my country of origin or in the US or in other parts of the world, it's mostly to connect big cities, initiate development. This was not the case in Africa. So the effects were positive, but they were very localized.
Brilliant. Thanks so much for that. Maybe just shifting gear a little bit onto more of the institutional side of the debate. One observation that is sometimes made from parties who are more sympathetic to the colonial project is that why has there not been made more leverage or more effective use of the infrastructure dividend that was left by the European colonial powers? The question is there any policy financing element or any social structures that prevented newly independent African states from better utilizing, leveraging, and developing their colonial infrastructure endowment?
Let me say, that's a fantastic question. Let me try to escape part of it. Leonard Wantchekon will have 1.5 full session on post-independence, and I know that he will discuss a lot those issues. They relate a bit to something that he started discussing with some of our friends last week about inappropriate policies or erroneous policies that many newly independent African states did in this, not necessarily in the 60s, but most likely in the 70s. Now, in line with the question, we have some interesting research, for example, in Senegal, where actually colonial railroads were abandoned. So even the local effects, quote unquote, dissipated. Now, the typical answers that at least you will hear in my profession would relate to the political instability and this civil conflict that emerges in the continent sometime in the late 60s, early 70s. So during those conflict decades, which accelerates in the 80s, many of those investments, not only railroads, but also schools, clinics actually are destroyed or perhaps fully destroyed. So I think the question is spot on in the sense that sadly, because of the weak state capacity that newly independent African states inherited from the administration, from the colonial administration, they quite often they didn't even manage to maintain those investments. And let me say that civil conflict played a huge role. For example, with Stelios and Giorgio Chiavelli, we have a paper on assessing the effect of landmines in Mozambique. Mozambique becomes independent in 1975. These 3.5-4 railroads and road networks, those development corridors, as they was coined, they were all mined during the Civil War, and actually demining did take time. So that's another, actually, I think, a good example of not even managing to benefit from those railroads that were connected, for example, to Zimbabwe at the time. Again, you are muted.
Thank you so much for illuminating those points. Just going on to develop more on the theme of persistency. The question, and maybe this is another unfair one, was on this topic of the local elites that in some way facilitated the colonial project. The question is, was there any serious effort to support the development of more egalitarian or democratic institutions at the time of the unwinding of the colonial project? Or is the existence of these elites a core tenet to the strategy of maintaining the persistency of colonialism or the colonial benefits that European colonial powers enjoyed?
That's again another great question. And from my reading, there seems to be wide heterogeneity. So the study I covered from Sierra Leone, I think it's an illustrative case of persistence of political power at the local level. We have other examples. I think Leonard mentioned a couple last week. Clearly, Julius Nyerere in Tanzania, and Zamora Marcel, who effectively, tried to follow his paradigm, explicitly tried to lower and, if anything, minimize the role of traditional authorities and chiefs. Regulus in the case of Mozambique. This now, and this was part of a socialist kind and Pan-African kind of agenda that was very pervasive in Africa, by the way, not only in Africa at the time. So we do see episodes where the leadership of the newly independent states tried to bring down, if you like, minimize the role of local elites. In the case, now let me start with the good news. There is very interesting work, for example, in Tanzania, showing that actually nation-building policies that Nyerere did had worked well. On the other side, these kind of policies were part of a very socialist and, a kind of agenda at the time of, self-sufficiency in food, very influential at the time conjectures, which effectively didn't play out very well. In the case of Mozambique, that I know because I do some field work there, actually Regulus, when they saw their influence being brought down, they joined Renamo and effectively destabilized the country during the early phase of the Mozambican Civil War. Because again, you have resistance. And let me use this, your question, which I think is spot on. This is a more general point. By no means, this is not only Africa. Political elites, let me give one example from my country of origin. When Greece becomes independent, the political elites were those who were the collaborating, they were collecting taxes for the Ottomans. They resist a lot the new mode, the new mode of political structure. Actually, they even assassinate the first Greek ruler of the new independent state. So there is nothing unique on African here, and this is something that all four of us want to stress. So there was a lot of heterogeneity. I think what happened, and from my reading of Mamdani's book and a bit of Fatsemoglu and Robinson, is that the fact that you had conflict and the state system collapsed, effectively those local elites, if anything, they became empowered. Because there was no state, so someone had to provide some local public goods.
Understood. Thanks so much for that. Maybe then turning to the case studies that you shared, I think there's some really fascinating illumination of the strength of the pre-colonial institutions, particularly in the case of Botswana. And so the question that has come about is, what was the role of identity in colonial resistance? Is this something that can be generalized to other countries outside of Botswana?
Well, I will not be able to offer much insight here in the sense that national identity, building a national identity is a challenge for all African states after independence. My digression here, especially to our friends joining from Africa, again, this is not an African issue by no means. There is some evidence that, when Italy or France or even Greece become independent, most people in France or Italy or Greece were not even speaking the same language. So again, this is not a purely African issue. As Stelios illustrated in the Scramble for Africa, this was a bigger perhaps problem in Africa because, Nigeria was nothing like Nigeria. It was like in the map that the French and the British at some point drew. So this was a huge challenge for newly independent African states. One route, which was the Nkrumah and the Nyerere route, was, okay, let's try to build national identity. And part of it was, let's try to tone down the influence of traditional leaders, of healers, of those local elites. In some cases, this backfired because, quote unquote, the state perhaps didn't have the means to enforce that. The Botswana is perhaps an interesting case in the sense that it just happened that those colonial borders, roughly speaking, contained all the Tswana kingdoms. It included also the homelands of some other smaller ethnic groups. So Botswana is ethnically diverse in the widely or linguistically diverse, but you have a very dominant kind of group. So perhaps in this sense, the border design was also a bit helpful. Let me also say here, this is an explanation that economists don't like much. Seretse Khama and the leaders that they had post-independence clearly, must have played a role. The interesting point, however, from an economics viewpoint, is that those leaders were effectively the continuation of some strong and relatively efficient and kind of representative pre-colonial structures that were not destroyed or much impacted by the British because they didn't much care about Botswana.
Thanks so much for that response. I think we actually shed a lot of light on the point. What has come through very strongly is a theme around human capital dividends that the colonial powers may have received, not only from the slave labor or the forced labor from the locals, but I guess from the absence of some of those, from the creation of the diaspora as a result of the colonial project. And a question that has come through is, as we think now of modern day Africa and the ongoing impact of colonialization, is there any discussion or role for study around the role of the intellectual capital that the diaspora could add to the to African countries in terms of thinking about what the impact of that extraction has been for African countries. It's a bit of a digression on the theme, but it is something that has come consistently, that question around a human capital deficit as a result of the colonial project and what could be done at this particular stage to address that dynamic.
Top-notch questions here, Tapiwa. Let me give my generic thoughts. First, we don't, to the best of my knowledge, I have not seen applied economic research on African diaspora in more contemporary times. Second, even outside Africa, it's not that it's full of academic works on the role of the diaspora and especially on human capital. There's a lot of research, for example, in financial economics on remittances, but not so much on human capital. The challenge there, and that's why there's not that much research in economics, is that of quote-unquote selection, in the sense that those, let's say, those Greeks that go to the States and then return, may be different than those who never left or those who left but never came back. So I think, and let me echo here my colleague and friend Leonard Wantchekon, that part of this initiative is to come up with new ideas. I think this deserves a lot of work. Now, Europeans, during the early stage, at least, of colonization, their primary objective was a bit to educate Africans, and again, with a minimum kind of investment, and that's why we see the rising presence of Christian mission. As Leonard pointed out last week, many of the leaders of African independence are very well educated, mostly coming from this system of missionary schools, which again is not surprising. And perhaps this has shaped a bit ideology. Now, looking forward, clearly, let me start with the very good news. If one was to tabulate, and I will show a pattern like that in week 10, African completed primary and completed secondary education, they are on the rise. And even college attainment is massively on the rise. The issue, and this is something that the World Bank keeps alarming African governments, is that the quality seems to not be as high as one would have wanted to. But again, to stress the positives here, we have actually some work with Stelios here showing that even those Africans who do not necessarily know how to read and write, but they have gone to school, still we see lower criminality, better access to public goods, better health outcomes. So I think there are bigger gains from education as compared to simply that our wages go up.
Fascinating. I think there are so many strands to this discussion that we could stay for another couple of hours. But I think at this point, sadly, you have to hand back the floor to conclude, Elias. But thank you very much for really illuminating the discussion and the opportunity to moderate. Back to you, Elias.
Thank you, Tapiwa. Thanks big time. And thank you all for posing these questions. So let me just preamble what we should see this week. So tomorrow we'll have Belinda Archibong and Roland Bungu. Effectively, we will Zoom in Nigeria. Belinda will discuss some super exciting work together with Nonso, who we hosted last week, effectively showing Tapiwa one of the negative aspects of transportation infrastructure in Nigeria. It was done by prison labor, which relates to the discussion we had about Congo and the widespread practice of forced labor. So they will discuss their work on the legacy of forced labor in Nigeria. And then Roland will discuss his work with Dozie Okoye, who again we hosted last week, zooming into the impact of transportation infrastructure investments in Nigeria. Actually, you did ask me a question about heterogeneity. So actually their work is about that. So I think it's very interesting in the sense that we're zooming in Nigeria, and we will continue the discussion that we started today in our Q&A. Let me repeat again that every Friday we have the recitations where Alfred, Julian, Alex, and Guy are going over this work in more detail. And as again, we have uploaded the slides. We will post shortly the Q&A to last week's introductory week on colonization. And let me also tell you once more how lucky and privileged and honored Leonard, Stelios, Nathan and I are for your participation. Keep sending us emails, what we can do better and improve, what we're doing awful and we should improve more, what we're doing decently well. And thank you again for being with us. Finally, let me flag that the Wheeler Institute has also launched a climate initiative where my great colleague Lucretia Reichling is interviewing policymakers, business people, practitioners, discussing issues related to climate change, one of the most challenging issues of our world today. I know that there are many events, so perhaps you are interested in a bit. So I just want to flag that on Thursday, Lucretia will interview Sir Ronald Cohen, a very prominent venture capital private equity investor in the UK, about the work on climate investment. Thank you all for being with us, and we hope to see you tomorrow at our lecture, Zooming in Nigeria and the Role of Prison Labor and Transportation Infrastructure. Tapiwa, thanks big time again.